Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Veritas Forum for inviting me to participate in this debate this evening. The questions that we're going to be talking about are of profound importance, and it's my hope that the discussion tonight will be a significant step forward in each of your own personal spiritual journeys. Now, when we ask the question, scientific naturalism versus Christianity, we're asking which of these two worldviews is true. Accordingly, we must conduct our inquiry on the basis of the 9 fundamental logical laws of reasoning. And we need to ask ourselves the two questions. First, what reasons are there to believe that scientific naturalism is true? And secondly, what reasons are there to believe that Christianity is true? Well, with respect to that first question, by scientific naturalism, I mean the view that the natural world is all there is, and that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. Now, think about the claim that the natural world is all there is. This claim is logically equivalent to atheism. But I can't even imagine how you could scientifically prove atheism. Since science only studies the natural world, how could science possibly prove that there is nothing beyond the natural world? The only way that the naturalist could hold this would be by faith. But then he would contradict his own view, which says that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. And thus his position seems to me to be internally incoherent. Now, consider that second claim, that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. I submit that this claim is demonstrably false. First of all, it's too restrictive. There are all sorts of truths which we all rationally accept, but which cannot be scientifically proven. For example, mathematical and logical truths, metaphysical truths like the external world is real, ethical truths, aesthetic truths, and even scientific truths. The fact is that science itself is permeated by unprovable assumptions. For example, the theory of relativity, one of the twin pillars of contemporary physics, is based on the assumption of the constancy of the speed of light between any 2 points, A and B. But this is strictly unprovable. We simply have to make this assumption if we're to hold to the theory. And thus, it is simply too restrictive to contend that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. But worse than that, the naturalist claim is self-refuting. For consider the statement, quote, "we should only believe what can be scientifically proven," end quote. Can that statement be scientifically proven? Well, obviously not. And thus the scientific naturalist's position refutes itself, and so it cannot be true. And thus there seems to be no good reason to believe that the natural world is all there is, and there's certainly no good reason to believe that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. In short, it's hard to see any good reason to think that scientific naturalism is true. So what about that second question? Are there any good reasons to think that Christianity is true? By Christianity, I mean the view that God exists and that he has revealed himself decisively in Jesus Christ. Now, I'd be the first to admit that you can't prove compellingly these two claims. But I do think they can be shown to be reasonable, and in fact more reasonable than their denials. Take that first claim that God exists. I believe that there are in the natural world certain signposts of transcendence, as it were, which point beyond the natural world to a greater reality as its ground. For example, signpost number 1, the origin of the universe. The astrophysical evidence indicates that the universe began to exist in a great explosion called the Big Bang 15 billion years ago. Physical space and time were created in that event, as well as all the matter and energy in the universe. Therefore, as the Cambridge astronomer Fred Hoyle points out, the Big Bang theory requires the creation of the universe from literally nothing. Now, this tends to be very awkward for the naturalist, for as Anthony Kenny of Oxford University urges, a proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make sense. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. And from the very nature of the case, as the cause of space and time, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. Isn't it incredible that the Big Bang theory thus fits in with what the Christian theist has always believed, that in the beginning, God created the universe? Now, I simply put it to you, which do you think is more plausible, that the Christian theist is right, or that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing? I at least don't have any trouble assessing these alternatives. Signpost number 2, the complex order in the universe. During the last 30 years, scientists have discovered that the existence of intelligent life depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are vastly more probable than any life-permitting universe like our own. How much more probable? Well, the answer is that the chances that the universe should be life-permitting are so infinitesimal as to be incomprehensible and incalculable. For example, Stephen Hawking has estimated that if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, then the universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball. P.C.W. Davies has calculated that the odds against the initial conditions of the universe being suitable for star formation, without which planets could not exist, is 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros at least. John Barrow and Frank Tipler estimate that a change in the strength of gravity or of the weak force by even 1 part in 10 to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. There are around 50 such quantities and constants given in the Big Bang which must be fine-tuned in this way if the universe is to permit life. And it's not just each quantity which must be finely tuned. The ratios between these constants must also be exquisitely finely tuned. So improbability is multiplied by improbability, until our minds are reeling in incomprehensible numbers. There is no physical reason why these constants and quantities should have the values they do. The one-time agnostic physicist Paul Davies comments, "Through my scientific work, I have come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it merely as a brute fact. Similarly, Fred Hoyle remarks, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. And Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, calls this the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. So once again, the view that Christian theists have always held that there is a designer of the universe seems far more plausible than the atheistic view that the universe, when it popped into existence uncaused out of nothing, just happened to be, by chance, fine-tuned for intelligent life with an incomprehensible precision and delicacy. Signpost number 3, the existence of objective moral values in the world. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Many theists and naturalists alike agree on this point. For example, Michael Roos, a philosopher of science at the University of Guelph, explains, morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the last century who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? Like Nietzsche and Roos, I don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. After all, if there is no God, then what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the naturalistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down, I think we all know it. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. On the basis of these signposts of transcendence, it's reasonable to believe that there exists a creator and designer of the universe who is the ground and source of moral value. Moreover, I think it's reasonable to believe the specifically Christian claim that this God has revealed himself decisively in Jesus Christ. Here I want to share two further signposts. Signpost number 4, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, with the authority to stand and speak in God's place. That's why the Jewish authorities instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then we would have good grounds for believing that he was who he claimed to be. And there are, in fact, 3 established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today which support the resurrection of Jesus. Let me say a word about each one of these. Fact number 1, on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian scholar who has specialized in the resurrection, quote, by far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb, end quote. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent German New Testament critic Gerd Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Jews had no belief in a dying, much less a rising Messiah, and Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the end of the world. Luke Johnson, a New Testament critic from Emory University, muses, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. Finally, signpost number 5, the immediate experience of God. You can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by immediately experiencing him. Now, if this is the case, there's a danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract your attention from God himself. If you are sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external proofs that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. So, in conclusion, we've not seen any good reasons to think that scientific naturalism is true. Moreover, we have seen 5 signposts of transcendence which point beyond the universe to its ground in a creator and designer of the universe who is the locus of absolute goodness and has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Together, I think these provide a powerful cumulative case for the truth of the Christian worldview.
Thank you, Professor Craig, and we now turn... We now turn to Professor Hardin's initial presentation.
My presentation will be considerably different, I think, from the last speaker's, no doubt because my personal history is quite different. And I'm going to tell you a story I've never told before, a story from my childhood, but I think it's probably relevant to the points I'm going to try to develop. and I leave that up to you to see the relevance, so I'll try to point out things along the way. I began my story in my childhood when I'm told by my parents that I was one of these irritating, questioning children to age 3, always asking why. You know, it goes on until the parents think they'll go crazy, and they give them some sort of an answer. Well, I don't remember any of that. 3 was a little too early for my memory to work. But I do remember something that happened when I was either 7 or 8. And I should make the point, because of the question I'm going to raise here, that I did not come from anything that could even remotely be called a scientific background. My ancestors and relatives were farmers, and some of them businessmen, no scientists, no engineers, nothing even remotely resembling that. So whatever questions I raised came from my childishness rather than from my surroundings. This occasion that I remember very well was the occasion of a funeral in the family. I think it was my grandfather who had died, and this was out in the country. We were on a 160-acre ranch, and relatives and a few friends came from considerable distances, and this was in the days of the Model T Ford and muddy roads, and having come that far, they weren't about to go home in a hurry, so many of them stayed around for a week. A little long for guests, but it was all in a good cause because everybody caught up on the gossip. And of course, this being a very sexist world, it divided into 2 camps. The women stayed in the kitchen and in the bedrooms doing the household chores while they caught up with the gossip in their way. The men went hunting. They took the few dogs that were around and their guns and went hunting, and but the talking, it was probably not too different from what it was among the women. I don't know. I was only with the men. But I cannot give you the exact words, but I can certainly give you a feeling for my feelings at that time and how they carried on. I was walking with my father through an abandoned orchard. This was in November or December. There was a light snow on the ground, and the dogs were misbehaving as usual, having to keep them behind the guns, which is always hard, hoping to see a rabbit, and now and then we did see a rabbit. And I was walking with my father, and I, making small talk perhaps, I said, I understand that God made everything and all the people in the world. But what I don't understand is who made God. Now, I don't remember my father's exact words, but I do remember the atmosphere that developed. My father became very angry. I only saw him out of the corner of my eye, but I had the feeling his face was flushed, and he said in a very emotional voice, "That's a question you must never ask." I got the idea. This was taboo. I didn't know the word taboo, but I got the idea. And from that day on, I never asked the question, where did God come from? Who made God? Because I realized you just don't ask that question. And thus, I had to make do with what I could make of my own cogitations. Well, you see, what's involved here is the idea of an infinite regress. You can say somebody else, Zeus made God. Well, who made Zeus? Well, Thor made Zeus. And who made Thor? And you go on back and back and back. But you see, you can never end this infinite regress. So this is no satisfactory, rational answer to a problem, an infinite regress. On the other hand, as a previous speaker pointed out, to get something from nothing is also very disturbing. I found these equally disturbing and never tried to put my money on one or the other. I just felt this was a dead end, and was largely not interested in it. The part of the trouble, I think, is moving on to more adult concepts. Whatever one means by God, you don't mean anything as childish as you start out with the idea of an old man with a beard. And of course, nowadays, you wouldn't dare do that anyway, because it should be an old woman. But in those days, it just, I thought of it as a person. I couldn't see any evidence for any person that could be called God, and nobody told me any. Nobody volunteered the information, either then or later. What this boils down to is a problem in words and the use of them. And I want to quote to you from a passage from the Bible, which I think is immensely wrong. This is a passage by John, Epistle to the Hebrews, in which he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." End of quote. Now I want to contrast that with the motto of the Royal Society. This is a Royal Society, essentially it's a scientific society in England. The Royal Society, which was founded in 1660. Their motto is nullius in verba, which is derived from Horace, a poet of the first sentence, and abstracted from a long passage, but the general feeling people agree on, nullius in verba means there's nothing in words. You can't prove anything with words. There's no authority in words. I see that's utterly different from what John was saying, that the Word was God. And this, of course, is absolutely basic to all of science. There's nothing in words. There's something behind the words, which we're trying to get at with words. And sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, but it's always questionable. And one of the things we have to accept is that some of the greatest scientists have confessed that they do not work with words, that these come later. These are the window dressing. Niels Bohr, who was the most important personality of the first half of the 20th century in theoretical physics, he inspired so many people. He set them on the right track to making Nobel Prize winners of themselves. When he was approached by a young man named Abraham Peiss, Peiss reported this contact this way. He said, "The first thing Bohr said to me was that it would be profitable for me to work with him only if I understood that he was a dilettante." He explained how he had to approach every new question from a starting point of total ignorance. Now, you see, this is a great contrast with what one usually thinks of great scholars who approach things with all the knowledge and so forth and so on. And Bohr said, "I'm just a dilettante. I'm just playing around. I don't know." Einstein was approached several times, principally by Hardin, who wrote a history or a treatise on the use of language in science and how scientists worked. Said, "The words or the language as they are written or spoken do not seem to play any role in my mechanism of thought." That's a pretty extreme statement for a man of Einstein's standing to make. And on another occasion he said, "I very rarely think in words at all. A thought comes and I may try to express it in words afterward." And he said the belief of certain people that thinking is always in words made him laugh. This, I think, we should take very seriously, and I think this is a way of operating not only among the giants in science, but also, to a lesser extent, to the extent that they can, among the ordinary foot soldiers, that a great many of them do not operate with words, except at the last moment, so to speak. They're operating with ideas, with visions of movement, of relationships, and so forth and so on. And somewhere along the line, before they can talk to somebody else, they have to put some words to it. And that, of course, is where the trouble may come in. Einstein, by the way, did not speak until he was 3 years old, so he'd ordinarily be classified as a backward child. And at 9, it was recorded that he spoke with great reluctance in class, as though he were thinking a long time before he'd be willing to speak. You see, so this is a deeply ingrained thing. He was not talkative. I find that it helps to think of our way of taking into ourselves the phenomena of the world, that we do this with three filters. The first filter is often called the literate filter, or the verbal filter, or the language filter. But let's say literate filter. And this, of course, must have been employed long before there was such a thing as literacy, that is, reading and writing. The second filter did not come in until science started, I think. And this is the numerate filter. You asked how much, how many, how big, how small. And as soon as you did that, many things that you thought you had firmly in mind turned out to be rather different from what you thought. Now, this grew during about 2,000 years of the growth of science from the Greeks to the present time. And it was only beginning about a century ago that a third filter was added, finally in a very conscious way, and this is the one I call the ecolate filter, the filter of ecology, the filter that deals with the relations of one thing to another, of the relative sizes and the consequences of that, rates of change and the consequence of that, and the possibility of thresholds below which something won't happen. A whole bunch of things, but all dealing with relations of many variables. And this is, I think, characteristic of our time, and this is not fully appreciated. One of the things that happens to people who don't have the ecolate filter at all, don't use it at all, is that they make projections of present trends into the future, and then they're surprised when they don't happen. Well, this has now become so widely recognized that we have a phrase for this. We speak of the unexpected consequences of actions. In other words, you have the theory that's very good indeed, and it predicts all sorts of things, but some things it just fails completely. They turn out to be quite different. And when you look back, you discover you didn't notice certain relationships to things outside of your system. And so the ecolate filter says be sure that you find out the relations between things as well as their names and their sizes. Now, it does seem to me that many of the things that religion deals with really have to be criticized as being just on the verbal level, that they are literate level. They're words that are plausible, but beyond that you can't say very much. They're sort of an informal approximation to the facts, to the ecology of the situation, to the total situation where unintended consequences happen. And this, I think, is true of words like spirit and intuition, sanctity, and God. I just don't think one can give any exact meaning to any of these. A part of the scientific attitude, a very important part, is found in Descartes' Meditations, which set the spirit of science in an important way. He said in the beginning of the Meditations, which he wrote at age 46, he said, "Some years ago, I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely. To demolish everything completely and start again, right from the foundations, if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last." In other words, he's saying one has to become as a child and look at it all over again. This is not easy to do. You have to take your doubts seriously and face each one of them, and don't at any point in desperation say, well, you just have to have faith in that. Faith is not, to a scientist, faith is a form of vice. He doesn't indulge in it, not consciously. A friend of mine in Texas few years ago, about a decade ago, told me of wonderful bumper sticker that he was seeing all over his large city. The bumper sticker said, "God says it, I believe it, that settles it." Now that, I think, is as far as you can possibly get from the scientific attitude. But it makes many people very happy, and so maybe it should be tolerated or even encouraged. However, that isn't the scientific spirit. And an important element of the scientific spirit was contributed by a French philosopher, Montesquieu, in 1721, when he wrote the Persian Letters. He wanted to criticize many things in his world, and he realized that there was danger in criticizing them. They were not so far from the Inquisition and other forms of violence stimulated by religion that he was willing to take a chance. So he pretended, this is a story of letters, a Persian visiting France was supposed to have written home to his friends at home. And by pretending in that way, he could say all sorts of things that he otherwise couldn't have gotten away with. He commented, for example, he broke into it gradually. He pointed out the very humorous thing that in France, the men wear trousers. Can you imagine that? You see, in Persia, it was the women who wore trousers, and yet these funny men wear trousers. And also the men had wigs, and they cut off their hair and they put wigs on. And that was a very curious thing to do. Then he said there is a magician at the head of the French government who can make 2 million crowns do the work of 1 million just by declaring a new value to the crown. So he's plainly a magician. And in Rome, there's another magician who can make 3 into 1. And that, of course, is the Trinity. And Montesquieu did not dare to ridicule the Trinity, but he could have his Persian visitor do so. At any rate, this was an important step in the development of a more critical view towards literacy, towards literate values. And it was continued by Adam Smith, who in 1759, this was before he became an economist, invented the idea of a disinterested spectator. He says, "I divide myself, as it were, into 2 persons, and one of them is a disinterested spectator." And the word disinterested is meant in the economic sense, a person who has no economic or other interest, see, not intellectual interest, but material interest in the outcome. And you have to be a disinterested visitor, disinterested spectator. Very shortly thereafter, somebody invented the man from Mars, pretended, see, of course, this is just Montesquieu's Persian visitor, but from a more distant place, and even more objective, I think you can say, than a Persian would be. And the man from Mars continues to the present day and is still a useful intellectual tool to use when you're trying to make yourself into a disinterested observer. Say, well, now, what would the man from Mars say about this? See, in other words, shed all your taboos and conventional beliefs and try to answer, what would he say about this?
Thank you very much, Professor Hardin.
So that, I think, presents the basis of in which I would say that we have to analyze this in terms of the language pathology rather than in terms of fact.
Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.